also writes, beauty is a divine energy of God. It is distinct from the essence of God, which is unknowable and not simple. We can participate in the energies of God, but we cannot know his essence. Let's talk about it. I want to talk about divine simplicity. I want to talk about this idea of God being simple versus God being complex. The three qualities that I often think about in relation to God are perfection, infinitude, and eternity. These are three qualities that God must have, otherwise, God would be imperfect, God would be limited, God would be mortal. These are not qualities that I think, if we ascribe them to something, that thing cannot be called God in my semantic definition. Somebody wanted to put that forth, that God was mortal, God was limited, and God was imperfect, then I would suggest that would be a lower form, that would be immortal, right? So there's a distinction here. So what do we mean when we say God is perfect? Well, perfection really, from my mind, it does imply a form of simplicity. That if we look at a circle as compared to a triangle, as compared to a square, as compared to a pentagon, as opposed to a hexagon, that as we're increasing in complexity, we are actually reducing the simplicity. That simplicity implies that we are reducing the amount of information, the amount of rules and laws and added quantities and qualities. So, a circle which is a single color is more simple than a circle which has many different colors. So as we reduce qualities as well as quantities of a thing, we are effectively making it more simple. And so I would suggest that, as we reduce qualities and quantities sufficiently, we're ultimately going to come to a place, I think, where we have to eliminate these altogether. Now, these ideas are being brought forth by Also. I want to make sure I'm getting his name right. Also, he brings these forth in response to a video that I had made where I said basically that beauty is God in a way. And I think I'm kind of contradicting myself here and maybe using this term God in different ways. I think in that video specifically, I'm not really making a theological argument so much as an aesthetic argument. I'm saying that beauty should be worshipped and held up as the highest thing. And that which should be held up and worshipped as the highest thing, we could call that God. But in another context, we're going to use the term God differently. And let me try to explain what that other context is. So as we reduce qualities and quantities, I think if we take that to its ultimate conclusion, we're going to see through someone like Schopenhauer this distinction between will and representation. That representation, for my opinion, and if someone wants to correct me or argue or debate or whatever, then I'm open to that. But when we say that, when we talk about representation, we're talking about objects with quantities and qualities, which make them complex. But behind that is will. And there are seemingly many disparate wills, within ourselves. We have a will to, listen to our base instincts. We have a will to follow aggressive moralization. We have a will to somehow reconcile the two. And then different people have different wills. Some people want to, go to war. Some people want peace. And then we see between different groups and different, every sort of particle from that Schopenhauerian perspective has its own kind of will, separate from the other wills in a sense. But there's an ultimate idea that all of these wills have to proceed from a fundamental will. And that fundamental will we would call God. And that will, that pure will, has no representation in itself. It doesn't have a body. It has no objective qualia or quantity. It is the source behind all objects, qualities, and quantities. So for human beings, we have qualities and quantities. We are complex because we have bodies, and these bodies are objects. We have organs. But, we are not completely simple. The pure will, the foundation and the source of all things, to me, that is the most simple thing, because it does not have quantities or qualities. I want to kind of refer back to the comment here. Beauty is a divine energy of God. I guess my argument would be that, from what I understand, and again, I'm happy to debate on the channel. I don't really want to do a lot of text debates because it's not fruitful for me, and I'm not interested. But I'm happy to debate people. This concept of the energy essence distinction, that there are certain energies of God and we can participate in those energies. And what would the example of these energies be? His goodness, his blessings, his love, so all these positive qualities, maybe these would be the energies, or the creation of the world, material things, matter. These are energies of God. A God is like the sun, and that's the essence, but then the sun's rays that hit us, the light, that is the energy. And in some senses, I have to disagree. I have to disagree that when we talk about all these energies, that these things are God. And I think these energies are complex. And I guess I'm using the term energy here in an Einsteinian sense of energy is equivalent to matter, E equals mc squared. That there is actually an equivalence between matter and energy. And, maybe even Heraclitus and some of the pre-Socratics recognize that on some level, the idea that everything is fire, everything is reducible to fire, as opposed to Thales, who believed it was reducible to water. Out of the four elements, he thought water was the most fundamental. So this concept of energies, to me, is about matter, and matter is a construct of the syntax of extension, big and small, of temperature, so that would be the average kinetic energy of the particles. So all of these things are not God. These are not qualities of God. Beauty is a divine energy of God. I don't even know that I would say that. I don't even know that I would say that any of these energies are of God. What do we mean of God? Do we mean simply that they proceed from God, they're a result of God? Do we say that bigness is of God, smallness is of God, heat is of God, cold is of God? I don't think that we can. I don't think we can say God is big. I don't think we can say that because I don't think he's a material object that we can measure. I don't think we can say he's small. So we can certainly say that things are big and things are small, and bigness and smallness they are results of God's will. God has willed quantity and quality into existence, but he himself does not have quantity and quality in himself. And the essence of God, which is unknowable and not simple, I almost think it's the opposite. I think if we understand God as the perfect, simple will that wills all wills, the willer of wills, the origin of all that is, was, and ever will be, then that, in a sense, God is the most simple thing. He is the most simple thing. Now, you could say, in a sense, he's beyond simplicity, because you could make the argument that only objects can be simple or complex. Simplicity and complexity are terms that we use to describe material objects. But if you continue, I mean, from my perspective, do we say that God is the one or the many? I mean, monotheism would suggest God is the one. Now, the one and the many are quantities that describe objects, right? But I don't know. It's tough because it does sort of seem paradoxical. If you remove, is the number 0 closer to the number 1 or closer to the number infinity? I did say before that God was infinite. I might have to, I don't know. I'm questioning now. I'm questioning now these two perspectives. How do we reconcile this? Because in a sense, it seems to make sense that God is infinite, but there's a contradiction between perfection and infinitude, and even to say that God has a nature. Well, what is nature? Nature is the natural world. Does God have a nature? Does he have a nature? Well, what is a nature? If we say it's human nature, we're talking about behaviors, psychologies, qualities. If we say it's in his nature or the nature of the thing, we're really describing its substance. And God does not really have a material substance. So, yeah, to say that God is infinite, that's a tough one. But again, I have to come back around. I know this is paradoxical and people can rip it apart, but I have to come back to the idea of aesthetics. I have to come back to the idea of beauty. And to me, the idea, like, there's a source behind these three things: eternity, perfection, and infinitude. And they can all sort of be reduced to one another. You can say that, eternity is simply infinite time, and that perfection is simply infinite simplicity. Maybe that's a contradiction. And then you can say that, eternity is perfect immortality, that infinitude is perfect boundlessness, that perfection is the result of eternal perfectionizing, and that infinitude is the result of eternal addition. That concept of infinite simplicity, eternal infinite simplicity, I think that's fundamental. Infinite simplicity, something that has no quantities or qualities of its own, but that is able to generate all other things. And so it is kind of this groundless grounding. It does not have, it is simple in the sense that it does not have any qualities in itself, but it is infinite in the sense that it's able to generate everything else. The simplicity side of it, to me, would be the essence of God, if we're to use those terms, and the infinitude would be the energies. Things in themselves, particular objects, cannot be infinite, and perhaps even the sum total of things cannot be infinite, but the concept of infinitude proceeds from God. So, if anything can be said to have infinity or to possess it, it would be God. God possesses all things, even those things which don't exist. Like in calculus, we have the concept of the limit, and we use the concept of infinity even if it's not instantiated in reality or cannot be instantiated in reality. It's still a construct or an idea that is fundamental to reality in some sense, at least to mathematics or our understanding of reality. It seems to be a tendency. Can there really be zero? Can there really be nothing? The Greeks did not think about that. This concept of zero, absolute nothingness. And for them, the origin was not emptiness and void. The origin was chaos. Everything was chaos. And so there's no concept of nothingness there. But if you infinitely reduce quantities and qualities, you end up with a nothingness. The reduction of complexity, historically, I always look back to Zoroaster and say that he had this pantheon of polytheistic gods with many different qualities and quantities, and he reduced them in what he thought would be the simplest system, which is a dualist system of good and evil, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, as the gods of light and darkness, respectively. But Judaism, which I think comes out of that, reduces things further and says we don't have a need for the Angra Mainyu, and perhaps even consolidates the two. And the devil or the opposer comes up, in the case of Job. But ultimately everything proceeds from the sovereignty and will of God. And there isn't this struggle. The struggle is human beings with their competing wills and things in the world, material world, competing wills. But within God, there is no conflict. God cannot be against himself. So I think that this statement, beauty is a divine energy of God. It is distinct from the essence of God, which is unknowable and not simple. In a sense, I could be convinced perhaps of that line of argument. Beauty is a divine energy of God. That to say that, well, God is not beauty, but God produces the syntax that allows for both beauty and ugliness. Just as he produces both good and evil. People would say that's heretical, that God is only good, that evil is an absence of God. But God created the tree with the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Even if you can say, evil is just an absence of God, well, God created and allowed for that absence. You could say it proceeds from free will. Beauty is a divine energy of God. It is distinct from the essence of God. Yeah, in a sense, if we replace the term beauty with just qualities and quantities are divine energies of God. Qualities and quantities are creations of God. They are objects, or they're the syntax that creates objects. Without qualities and quantities, we can't have objects. Distinct from the essence of God. But what I would put after that, it's distinct from the essence because energies, matter, are complex. And therefore, the essence of God must be completely simple, and therefore, I think knowable. I think knowable, although that question of knowledge, what does it mean to know God? I think we can know God, we can say God is the simplest idea, and therefore, in a sense, God is the most knowable thing. That we know God in a more certain, the most certain way possible than anything else, because everything else is contingent on God, right? You know, I can say, well, I'm looking around and I see some clouds, but it could be a mirage. I could be hallucinating, right? But the qualities and quantities that go into that color, shape, extension, form, the number of clouds, all of those things, those ideas have to proceed from some origin. And that origin, we call that God. And so we're certain, in a sense, our perception is uncertain, right? But the fact that we are perceiving is certain. Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. The I-ness is sort of suspect, right? What is this I? What is this I we are so certain about? So we cannot really be certain about the I, in my opinion, because the I is like the ship of Theseus. It's always changing. You know, it's malleable. We're not so sure about this I. We perceive ourselves, but our perception is flawed. And so it's possible that this I construct, this consciousness that we're certain about, that could be flawed. But what we can be certain of, I think, is that there's a perceiving process going on, and that perceiving process proceeds from some kind of either that there are material things to perceive, or that perception is simply a possibility because there are ideas of quantities and qualities, even if those things in themselves are not real. Like when we look at a cloud, we say, well, the cloud is real. It's right there. It's a material thing. But the cloud ultimately is a representation of really a lot of different water molecules that are, you know, on that level, not really a cloud at all, and reducing that further to quarks or something, string theory. The representation that we have of a cloud is an illusion that's produced as an approximation, as an attempt to perceive the true thing, but that is very flawed and inaccurate and, you know, a product of our will to survive, which does not have the capacity to fully, truly understand the thing in itself. So it makes you question, is there actually a thing in itself to be perceived? We can't really know that. I'm not sure that we can. But we know that even if we are not able to perceive the thing in itself, we are able to have ideas of what the thing could be. And those ideas have to proceed from a common syntax, right? When we say the cloud is big or small, that concept of extension is a quality, and it has to come from somewhere, right? It has to be a result of something. It has to be grounded on something. And so if it's not grounded in material reality, because that would be just the self-referential, well, things just are big and are small. It's like, what gives rise to extension? What gives rise to size? It's not grounded in itself. If you were to believe that, that would sort of be the nominalist position, as I understand it, where you're just saying, you know, things exist individually, independently of one another. There's no common syntax. But if we believe that things are reducible, that there's a common syntax, and that process of reducibility has an ultimate origin, then that would be God. So I guess I can agree with the first part of the sentence, but not the second one. And participate in the energies of God, but we cannot know his essence. Well, obviously we do participate in the energies of God. We do participate in matter. We have bodies, right? We cannot know his essence. This concept of the unknowability of God, that God is just a big mystery, you just can't know him, I think is the reverse of the case. I think God is absolutely knowable and more knowable than we know ourselves, because God is perfectly simple, divinely simple, right? Not simple, again, there's a distinction here between saying that 1 is the simplest number and 0 is the simplest number. 0 is not really a number at all. It's a placeholder for a lack of a number. And so God is nullus. He is I'm trying to think of some kind of fancier way to say that, zeroically. I'm trying to think of a good adjective here, but he is simple in the sense that 0 is simple, but he's not simple in the sense that 1 is simple, perhaps. And I don't know. I know the monistic view would say, yeah, God is the one. He is the most similar thing to number 1 that we can conceive of, as opposed to the dyads of syntax. And I understand that. And maybe there's a better case to be made for that. But I think ultimately, like, when we contrast the monad with the dyad, when we contrast oneness and harmony with complexity and chaos, we have to say that there's ultimately that's a dyadic system, but that there's ultimately one step above that produces both of them. So there's kind of like the material monism, and then there's like something higher than that materiality. But I mean, there's really nothing to know in a sense about God, because God doesn't have any qualities or quantities. He's not facts, he's not information. It's not like you have to know boom, 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 and then you have God. It's like God is behind all of those things. I mean, you could try to say he's unknowable if you define knowledge as information, and God is not information, he's pure will, and pure will is not knowable. But I don't know, I feel like, can we know will? Is will knowable? Can we know our own will? Knowledge of will, it would be a representation of will. This is a tough one. Is will knowable? If we say that will is not knowable, then I guess God would be unknowable since he's pure will. I might have just argued myself out of my position. I think this is a terrible video, but I wanted to make it anyway. Beauty as God. I'm still really attached to that. But I'm having a hard time dealing with the knowability of God and the knowability of will. Does will have a determinate direction? Does it have a substance in itself? No. It does not have a substance in itself, but perhaps it has a determinate direction toward a substance. And so the determinate direction of God as will would be toward the will, all other wills. So is that something we can know? Is that information about the will? Is it a representation? a model of who or what God is. I guess what I'm saying is that nothing is knowable, in the sense that information is representation. Representation is the only knowable thing, but because representation proceeds from will, and will is ultimately not knowable, nothing is knowable, right? Giving the example of the cloud, I look at the clouds and I say, I know the cloud is white and it's fluffy and it's big, but I actually don't know those things. Those things are these representations, right? I'm just saying, well, I look and it kind of appears to be this thing, but I'm not seeing the space between the molecules. I'm not seeing the empty space. I'm not seeing the quarks. I'm not perceiving those things. And so as a result, the knowledge that I have is very much contingent upon my will. The knowledge that I have is contingent upon my desire to live and to perceive. So, I know that my perception is flawed. My perception of all objects is flawed. And because it's based on will, and I can't know will. But God doesn't have any perceptible information to know. Like, let me put it this way. If I gave you a cell phone and I said, do you know the cell phone? You'd say, well, I know certain functions of the phone. I'd say, well, but do you understand the underlying processes? Do you understand the software? Do you understand the binary code? Do you understand the hardware? Do you understand the electrical connections? Do you understand the quark quantum, dynamics of the electrons in, your phone? And maybe some people out there could say, yes, but we clearly understand there's a lot of complex information that goes into that. But what if I gave you instead a thing that was simpler, simpler than a phone? If I gave you what's simpler than a telephone? If I gave you two cans and a string, and I said, do you understand two cans and a string? You'd say, yeah, I know two cans and a string. It's, these cylinders, and you've got, one of the sides of the cylinders is cut off, so you put it up to your ear, and you explain the vibrations, the sound vibrations. You talk into the cone, it goes through the string, you hear it in the other cone. Or not the cone, but the can, whatever. And so, but then I would break it down ultimately and say, okay, well, but what about the molecules again? We still haven't explained quantum physics. And you'd say, okay, I'm getting lost. But you could continue to do that process, theoretically, where you could continue to take simpler and simpler and simpler things by reducing quantities and qualities. And your knowledge of that thing, correspondingly, your capacity for knowledge of that thing would increase. And so what I'm saying is that if we look at the universe, in a sense, is unknowable because we ourselves are part of the universe, and so there's a problem of calculation. We can't calculate both ourselves and the universe at the same time. So the universe is unknowable. But as we reduce objects in the universe to smaller and simpler chunks, we are able to better know them and to understand them. And so if God is without qualities or quantities, and if he is the grounding behind all those things, he is ultimately the end process of an infinite, perfect, eternal process of simplifying until you get to the ultimate grounding. So in that sense, that's the sense in which I'm saying that God is the most knowable. Now you could make an argument that, I guess this would be agnosticism, that ultimately even that is unknowable because we cannot know will, because will is not information to be known. It is not knowledge. All knowledge is information. Information is quantities and qualities. So that would be my argument for why God is the most knowable. Even if he's unknowable, he's more knowable than anything else. And even if God is not simple, because he's behind both simplicity and complexity, he is at the same time the most simple, in the sense that simplicity and perfection are one and the same, are ultimately reducible to the same. All things find their reduction in God, because all things find their source in God. And so concerning the idea of beauty, both beauty and ugliness proceed from God, just as both good and evil proceed from God. We as limited human beings, talking about God, I think I'm going to lose 99% of people. Maybe not my audience. Maybe my audience is like 10 steps ahead of me and they're waiting for me to get to the conclusion here. But, 99% of people hear this and it's gobbledygook and nonsense and a waste of time. And so, for the average person, you can't tell them, God is both good and ugliness or something, or God is above good and ugliness. He actually doesn't have qualities. You can't say that God is good because God is above good and bad. You can't really say that to people on a sociological level. So there's a distinction, I guess, we have to make between the ideal God as a philosophical argument, and then God as kind of a pragmatic sociological tool of control and regulating people's behavior. These are two very different things, and the philosophical concept, you could say, is ancient, but oftentimes hidden, because the use of it and the understanding of it is a little bit, I don't want to say complicated, right? But clearly there's a problem here. Clearly there's a problem. And I think it is related to that concept of will, that we understand representation very well. Like, we look at a cloud, that's a cloud. We don't understand the willing process. We're not conscious of it because the will is unconscious. We don't look at a cloud and think, oh, it's my evolutionary desire for survival, allow me to perceive extension in space, and color, which is a survival strategy for prey defense and predation, so that I can, obtain food resources and mating resources and whatnot. And that is, the result of that is I can perceive a cloud. We're not thinking that consciously, even if it's true, in the same way that, we're not understanding God as the source of all things from a will-based perspective, because that's not really, there's not a direct utility. I would say ultimately there is a truthful utility to understanding God in this way, in that it allows us to reduce complexity and to see the grounding of things, and not, and to come to a kind of peace, to come to a kind of harmony. And I think that's where, to understand the origin of beauty and ugliness is to understand beauty and ugliness. I don't think you can really understand a thing without its origin. And so an understanding of God, I think, it is the foundation of understanding everything else, in a sense. And we try to work backwards. We try to work from the bottom up rather than the top down, oftentimes. And that's often flawed and contradictory. We can try to force it. And of course, we're limited in our ability to be conscious of the nature of God. God is unnatural, right? God doesn't have a nature in himself. He is the source behind all nature. Even when I say he, that pronoun he, the masculine pronoun, God is above masculine and feminine, right? So we have all these contradictions between this philosophical God and this pragmatic sociological God. And for me, there's a duality that's represented in some ways by God the Father, God the Son, or even God the Holy Spirit and God the Son. But Christ is really a perfect example of, what would Jesus do, right? So Christ is supposed to be the instantiation, a human being who has perfect, continuous, unstoppable, conscious awareness of God, and therefore acts in completely accordance with his own nature proceeding from God. That humans have a nature which proceeds from God, but that nature becomes perverted and flawed through false knowledge, not necessarily through ignorance, but through the introduction of lies and deception. And so if you can strip away those lies and deception through God, through connection to God, then theoretically you would act like the perfect man. And there's been, in Christian theology, there's a conflation between the man who is perfect and God. Or at least from our perspective as humans, if I was a broccoli plant, my God would be the perfect broccoli plant, right? But I'm a human, so my God has to be the perfect human. And you find this contradiction in polytheism between the representation of the gods as flawed, imperfect, almost like human beings on a large scale, versus the gods as ideals. So there was a lot of contradiction regarding Zeus, that there's all these myths about Zeus going off and doing terrible things, because it's really a psychological kind of Jungian investigation into, if you had ultimate power, what would you do? You'd turn yourself into a swan and find some pretty girls or something. Really weird stuff, honestly, with Zeus. But, that goes back to Egypt. Egypt had all kinds of crazy, weird myths about the gods. And so there, the gods are not perfect models of how you should act, but the myths of the gods are psychological thought experiments of what would human beings do or be like if they had ultimate or much larger power. So, and it's a thought experiment which allows us to better understand human nature. And so these myths which paint Zeus as a philanderer and earlier, Egyptian gods as, perverted, are useful because they help us understand human nature and the nature of personality and human will, but they're not necessarily ideals to aspire to. And that comes later with like the Platonic ideal that the myths of Zeus should be banned so that a perfect Zeus, a god king, can be made an ideal as the perfect ruler that people should aspire to be. And that kind of Platonic idea gives rise to the idea of Christ as the perfect man that has to be followed. So there's kind of God, or the gods, there's a perspective of religion which looks at models of understanding reality as it is and human nature as it is, so that we can act in the best way possible. And then there's a model of religion which says, no, don't tell people how it is. That's dangerous. Then they might be encouraged to, fall into that. They'll act like Zeus. They'll act perverted. Instead, don't even tell them that. Hide that from them. Hide human nature from them, and just tell them this is the ideal. And so this is where we get people saying things like, it is, even the term perversion, right? So we say, oh, it's women will say this about men. Oh, men are so perverted. It's like, are men perverted, or are men, completely natural in their desires? If they're natural in their desires, then it's actually perverted to be a chaste man. It's perverted to be a man who does not have these desires, right? So, and I talked about this in terms of marriage, right? So is marriage natural or is marriage perverted? In a sense, marriage is a perversion from our nature, because the nature is not to be married. The nature is to be fruitful, right? And those things don't always correspond one-to-one. And so in a sense, marriage is perversion. I think there is a shift in the Gebserian view, from the magical to the mythic to the mental consciousness structures, where, at first in the magical consciousness structure, you're simply trying to perceive energies, wills, psychologies, things as they are, and to give them reverence and power and beauty and respect, and their kind of due distance, to see things kind of as they are. And then in the mythic consciousness structure, there's an attempt to cut out certain things, to say, no, the rocks and rivers and streams aren't gods, but actually the gods are limited. They're not infinite, like in Shintoism, animism. They're more limited, and they are actually definable, in Paglia or Paglia, deriving from Nietzsche, this Apollonian idea. They're strictly defined. They have borders, they have limits, so we're introducing limits that you don't get in the magical consciousness structure. In the magical consciousness structure, everything is waves, everything is spectrums, and then you get these clearly definable mythic structures. And ultimately that gets consolidated further with the mental consciousness structure that says, no, we can't have myths of many different heroes like Perseus and Hercules and Apollo and Zeus, but we actually need to consolidate this further into a single god. In Zoroaster, you try to consolidate it into Ahura Mazda in opposition to Angra Mainyu, but then Judaism goes further and says, no, just get rid of Angra Mainyu and call Ahura Mazda Yahweh, the I Am, the foundation of existence. And so then we've run with that. And so there's this tension between the desire to understand things as they are and to tap into those existing energies, and then to cut off certain energies and say, no, God is some things but not other things. God is beauty. God has no ugliness to him. When in a philosophical sense, well, God is above both beauty and ugliness. So I guess the sense in which I'm saying God is beauty is, if we are to have a practical conception of God as an ideal to be strived for, there's a contradiction between God, the origin of all things, and God as the good side of things, or God as the ideal. God is the source of ideals, but he is in himself not an ideal to be strived for. We cannot be like God. We cannot try to be like God, but we can try to fit into a certain ideal that is, I guess in a Platonic sense, the Platonic ideal of a human being is a complex of all the different ideals of a person should be a certain size, they should have certain behavior. What is goodness? What is virtue? Well, goodness is courage, and courage is the ability to overcome fear. And, fear is a result of ignorance, or fear is a result of instinctual thinking. And, that's, I guess, a whole nother topic, what is fear? What is virtue? But that is the attempt. The attempt is to say, yes, there is a God who is behind all ideals. Therefore, every success and failure of an ideal proceeds from him, including beauty and ugliness. But this tension, this struggle between good and evil, beauty and ugliness, is one that we do partake in. And to live the beautiful life is to partake in the struggle between beauty and ugliness. And so, to the extent that we are following God, we are following beauty, because as we relate to God, we're relating to the will from which our will proceeds. And so, really, when Aleister Crowley says, do what thou wilt, he's really saying, and, I'm not a Crowleyite or anything, but I think the most charitable interpretation of that phrase is not do whatever you want, but it's actually, in a sense, figure out what you really want on a deeper level. And I mean, he's certainly engaged in all kinds of hedonism, but maybe this is a perversion of Crowley. I'm pitting him against himself, but this is not my original idea. That do what thou wilt is, reduce and strip away those false wills that you think are your will, but they're not really. Like, you think you want to be a hedonist, but, the Epicureans showed how there's a flaw to that form of superficial hedonism, that there's a deeper hedonism, and that perhaps the greatest pleasure in life is things like, being aware of God and pursuing your highest ideals and working hard, not being lazy and doing drugs, right? So I think that if we understand that goodness proceeds from God, God isn't goodness, but it proceeds from him, then a knowledge of God is going to allow us to best pursue goodness and beauty. So God is not anything. He is not existent as an object. He's the will behind existence, the will behind objects. But by knowing him, then we know beauty. And when we say God is beauty, I guess, that is a semantic contradiction to say he's above beauty and he is beauty. Those are, in a sense, we're talking about two different gods. We're talking about the philosophical God, and we're talking about the ideal God. There is a God above ideals, and then there is an ideal. Beauty is the ideal to be worshipped as a God, and we really, I think the term deity is better. Beauty is a hero. This esoteric conception of God that I'm using is, in a sense, relevant, right? Because that's where the ideal comes from. We're asking, what are ideals? What beauty is an ideal? Well, what is beauty? What do ideals, where do they come from? Well, they come from God. Okay? But then, how do we relate to those ideals? We hold them up and we worship them. It's almost, I view it like the moon, the moon has a light side and a dark side, but we only see the light side, And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in a sense, God, he doesn't have these qualities, but both of these things are coming from him. And that is when we just say God is the source of totality, are we going to worship totality? No. Worshiping God, I think, means that we relate to the totality through a heroic lens, through a lens of struggle, through a lens of participation. I think to participate in the energies of God means to understand ourselves as objects relating to a system, that we are not God, we are not amorphous, we are not infinite, right? We're not the source of all things. So we shouldn't try to be that. What we should try to be is perfect representations of ourselves, try to be the best people that we can be. And so from our perspective, it's kind of like God is the sun and we are people on the planet, and only a small percentage of the sun's rays ever hit us. 99.9 repeating % of the sun's rays just go off into space, and then 99.9 repeating, some of them hit the earth, and then some of them hit a continent, and some of them hit a landmass in a country, and then some of them hit us. And I think that's the best metaphor I can come up with for, yes, God is behind all these ideals, but we can't follow every ideal. We have to follow some ideals. And so to follow God is to follow those things which proceed from God, which are relevant to us. So we're not, even though beauty and ugliness both proceed from God, we're not going to we're not going to call God ugliness, certainly. And in a sense, it's not philosophically correct to say that God is beauty. But for us, God is beauty. And, I guess the term God, the reason I use it is because it is powerful. It does have this sociological linguistic power. We can't really choose we can't choose to usurp the linguistic framework that we're born into, because this is where we get our power. Our power is not, we can't just invent, I can't just say, well, there's a thing called a deity and another thing called a God. I mean, I could do that for the sake of clarity. I could distinguish between the monad is like this, but then God is something different. I should probably stop it there, right? Well, I've introduced a lot of concepts. Maybe I haven't resolved it, but if you enjoy listening to my crazed ramblings, please like the video, please comment, please subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at Jockkull, Jokkkull. If you do, I'll offer to video chat you, and if you can be merciful and tolerate my flaws and imperfections, we can do great things. So thank you for your time and attention. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Nice.
Subscribe. Very good.
Nice. Beautiful.
Very good.
Beautiful. You're going to love it. If you love autism, you're going to love my channel. Okay, great.
All right.